Good afternoon. If you're just tuning in, welcome to APAC's Legislative Leadership Summit. I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APAC's, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. Thank you for joining us as we dive into a panel discussion on the digital divide and lack of access. I'd like to thank our partners, AT&T, Charter, Comcast, and Verizon for sponsoring this panel. Before we begin, it is my pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Doris Matsui for opening remarks. Congresswoman Matsui represents the 6th Congressional District of California and has represented the city of Sacramento and its surrounding area since 2005. As a member of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, otherwise known as KPAC, she has always been a strong advocate of the AAPI community. We're thrilled to have her join us today, so please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Doris Matsui.
Hi to everyone gathering virtually for APEC's panel discussion on America's digital divide and lack of broadband access. As we adapt to changing work and learning environments, virtual events like this are a testament to the continued dedication to ensuring that everyone has access to reliable, affordable broadband. While it should go without saying, it is worth repeating. Broadband access is no longer a luxury. It is a fundamental part of modern life. The stakes for internet access aren't just about streaming videos online or updating social media. They're about who gets to participate and succeed in the 21st century economy. And that's why I'm so thrilled to join you today to discuss America's ongoing digital divide and what we can do to address it, especially for communities that have historically lagged behind others when it comes to affordable broadband access. While many Americans have adapted to working and learning from home, millions still lack access or are struggling to maintain internet connectivity. These are families across the country in urban cities and rural communities where reliable internet connectivity is unavailable or simply too expensive. In both cases, we are failing to ensure that all families, regardless of zip code or income, can fully participate in the modern economy. This has been especially difficult for the approximately 17 million kids that lack broadband at home. While the pandemic has exacerbated students' need for in-home broadband, all of us here today know that the homework gap will persist even after we defeated this virus. In our AAPI communities, the narrative put forward seems to illustrate that Asian Americans are a community with uniformly high digital access and literacy. However, this vastly oversimplifies a much more complicated issue. Disaggregated data shows a much more complex tapestry of AAPI subgroups that also include substantial disparities that must be addressed. As we continue to fight against stereotypes in all forms, the digital divide is unfortunately no different, and our solutions must holistically incorporate the many diverse voices within the AAPI community. And that's why I've been working hard to ensure that Congress maintains equity as a central pillar of how we approach broadband access. In March, Congress passed and the President signed the American Rescue Plan, which included new resources to keep Americans connected. The bill included more than $17 billion for the E-rate program, which helps schools and libraries provide free broadband service and devices to students. While this program has traditionally supported service within schools and libraries, the Rescue Plan allowed these community institutions to extend broadband service further into the community, reaching people where they live. For many families struggling to connect, schools, libraries, and other community anchor institutions have provided needed connectivity during the pandemic. And moving forward, I will be pushing to provide more resources and flexibility to help these organizations better serve their communities. To support low-income families and workers who have recently lost their jobs, Congress authorized $3.2 billion in broadband connectivity support. This emergency broadband benefit program will provide $50 per month in bill credits and offer a vital lifeline for those who need it most. But while we have made progress, there is still much more work to do, because we know that persistent inequities in broadband access have far-reaching consequences when it comes to performance in school, ability to find work, and accessing important social services. As the Biden administration and Congress turn to infrastructure, it is imperative that we remain focused on policies that create more equitable broadband access to all Americans, and look forward to working with everyone here today to do just that. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak, and enjoy the panel.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Matsui, for your unwavering leadership. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Michael Nguyen. Michael is currently the Senior Policy and Advocacy Associate with OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, where he leads the civil rights organization's national policy and advocacy efforts to educate and advocate on issues impacting the AAPI community. Michael, hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Madeline. So I'm very excited to be moderating this panel today on this very important topic, America's digital divide and lack of access. So this past year has proved that broadband access is essential for school, for work, and just life. But millions are still being left behind, including the AAPI community. Limited studies portray our communities as having already bridged the digital divide. But deeper analysis demonstrates that AAPIs still experience disparities and inequalities in broadband access. We know that fast and reliable internet is critical to providing economic opportunities, connecting up communities, and giving access to educational, health, and other indispensable programs. And so it's critical that families and communities continue to have access to an essential service beyond the pandemic. So to delve into this topic further, I'm thrilled to have this esteemed panel with us today to discuss this lack of access within the AAPI community, the challenges that we are seeing, and the ways in which these community leaders and industry partners seek to close the digital divide and ensure digital equity among all communities. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Albert Shen, who is the Strategy Manager of Public Sector Strategy at Verizon. We have Laura Berrocal, Vice President for Policy and External Affairs at Charter. Nirali Patel, Vice President for Global Public Policy at Comcast. We have Beth Fujimoto, Assistant Vice President of the Public Policy at AT&T. And finally, we have Emily Chi, who is the Assistant Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, otherwise known as AAJC. Thank you all for being here today. Before we start, I would encourage our audience members to use the Q&A section to ask questions that may arise during the discussion, and we will get to your questions during the audience Q&A towards the end of the program. So to start us off, I'd like to ask Emily. Emily, why is the lack of access and the digital divide a problem within the AAPI community?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. I'll be echoing a lot of the great points that the Congresswoman actually already brought up, but we can't emphasize enough that access to reliable high-speed internet is now an essential thing that all communities need access to. It's necessary to do everything else. Our communities rely on the internet to communicate with each other and stay in touch with family overseas, to access government programs and information. You know, if we consider the COVID vaccine signups and how critical internet was for that, applying to PPE loans, educational opportunities such as after-school ESL homework help, job trainings, language classes, how critical it is for the development of small businesses. You know, all these things were important before the pandemic and became even more critical during the pandemic, but will continue. We know that things like telehealth and online education aren't going away. And when we think about our students, our elderly, the folks who need these services the most, it's going to be really important to prioritize that they stay well connected and that the connections are affordable affordable and accessible to them. Like the Congresswoman said, Asian American Pacific Islanders are often not considered a community of focus when we talk about the digital divide, and that's really an extension of the model minority myth. And also a lack of data. So there are only a handful of studies about Asian American Pacific Islanders and the digital divide, and these are often conducted in English only, and are at least partially conducted just online. And we know that, up to 50% of our communities are not English proficient. So we're, by design of these studies, excluding critical parts of our communities that are likely to need these services the most. And also, like the Congresswoman brought up, the data is often not disaggregated. And we know that we're not a monolith, and that it's important to capture all the differences and disparities between our communities. So things like race, but also socioeconomic status, the level of education attainment, English proficiency, immigration status. And we know that when we look at other data indicators, such as participation levels in programs like SNAP, that there is high Asian American Pacific Islander participation. And that's kind of an indicator that those populations are likely also going to need assistance when it comes to broadband connections. So we need to start by documenting it, changing the narrative, and really acknowledging how important this is. And, we're hearing from our community partners on the ground, working directly with communities, that there is a greater need for devices, improvement to affordability, investments in infrastructure, and training to make sure the people who really need these services the most are getting access to it.
Thank you very much for providing that context, Emily. Now, I want to move on and talk about the challenges that we are seeing within the API community. So I want to direct this question first to Albert. So Albert, what are the challenges we're seeing in terms of internet access and adoption within the API community? Albert, sorry about that. I thought that was only on my end, but I can't seem to hear you, and I think the audience might not be able to hear you as well. So can you check your volume?
Does that work?
Perfect.
Okay.
Can you start over on what you're saying?
I'm sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you.
Here we are talking about technology, but no, thank you, Michael, for having me be here. Yes, the challenges for the Asian American community is obviously very vast and diverse, because our community is very vast and diverse all across the country. We're in the urban environment, suburban, rural communities, the Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, far out reaches parts of the globe too as well. So in terms of infrastructure has always been a big challenge in terms of getting that quickly into areas, but also exactly what Emily was saying in terms of affordability and adoption. Many different languages, many different ethnicities, many different cultural barriers that we have to overcome. But as industry here, I mean, that's upon us also to be part of that. And that's what we're doing, at Verizon, just like every other company here. We're doing our part relative, especially what has happened along with the Stop Asian Hate that's been going on, which has made it even more, more emphasized in terms of the importance of bringing and closing this digital divide. So overall, I think, this conversation has been long going, but I feel like every year we do make progress in terms of what we're doing, both policy, but also as industry too, in terms of reaching those communities. But it's also, each of us individually, for myself as being an Asian American leader within a company like Verizon, in terms of bringing awareness and bringing our understanding internally into what is the complexity of reaching the AAPI community. So, but overall, I see, this great cooperation is what Apex and you all doing, bringing us together to have this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Albert. Laura, how about you?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Michael. And good afternoon to everyone. It's wonderful to be here with all of you today, and happy Mother's Day. I think we all deserve an extra day given the year that we've all been kind of dealing with COVID. I actually still got a card from my daughter this morning, so I'm still celebrating. But in terms of your question, the AAPI community is so incredibly diverse across every category you can think of: geography, language, culture, and the list goes on. And I'd say while there are some consistent commonalities in other diverse communities, for example, across the Latino community, English and Spanish tend to dominate the language category. So the same, however, can't be said for the AAPI community, which just creates a new level of challenges just with language barriers sometimes and the need for translation in multiple languages. And this can also make it more difficult to assess what the adoption and access challenges are for some. So from the multicultural community perspective, we see a lot of factors such as geographic location, age, for example, that can play a big factor in both adoption and access. And I think you can say the same with the AAPI community as well. They fall in this bucket. And for us here at Charter, we obviously consider all of these factors when we're determining our broadband policy and business priorities, as well as our community investment priorities. As one of the leading broadband providers, obviously the issue of access and affordability will always be key priorities for our company. But one thing that I will say is that the pandemic has really made very apparent the continued challenge with home broadband connectivity. And we hear it time and time again. We heard it from the Congresswoman, we heard it from Emily. It continues to be a technology gap across many multicultural communities, including the AAPI community. On the more positive note, though, as a result of the pandemic, I think we've seen an accelerated response to addressing this issue head on. And it has been more of a collaborative response than potentially we've seen in the past by industry, government, community organizations, as well as anchor institutions. And I'd give you just one quick example for Charter. We actually rolled out what we call our remote education offer back in March of last year in response to the pandemic. And through the program, we actually connected 500,000 students, teachers, families, all to high-speed internet for 60 days at no cost. But the success of this expedited program rollout for Charter was very much tied to our community partnerships and the assistance that they lent us in offering to share the information across their networks and with their communities. And I think that this is an example of how these partnerships, when we work together, we can actually make sure that we're addressing some of the challenges that these communities are dealing with. We can tackle the issue in a way that addresses all of the broadband building blocks of access, affordability, as well as digital skilling that we all of our communities are facing right now. And hopefully we'll have more time to talk about some of the programs and initiatives, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Laura. We definitely will have some more time to talk about that. Nirali, I'll move on to you. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and thanks for having us today. I think it just bears repeating something that I think you, Emily, and the Congresswoman all alluded to, which is that within the AAPI community, contrary to some misperceptions, level of education, level of income, English language proficiency, all vary tremendously, and each of these factors can really contribute to a digital divide for AAPI individuals. At Comcast, we've also seen language barriers and economic barriers, particularly for new immigrant and refugee populations. And in addition, I think as Laura was mentioning, age and poverty also are two factors that really contribute to the digital divide within the AAPI community. I think, as we know, the elderly population within the AAPI community is a fast-growing population. I saw statistics that between 2009 and 2014, that population grew by 40%. So these are all factors that we need to be cognizant of as we're trying to reach more members of the AAPI community with our internet access and adoption efforts.
Thank you very much, Nirali. Beth, on to you. What challenges do you see within the API community in terms of internet access and adoption?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, APACS, for facilitating this very important conversation. I think what you're hearing amongst the panelists is there's really widespread agreement about what the biggest challenges in this area are, and in fact, over the weekend, I ran into an acquaintance who I hadn't seen in a while, asked me, what are you doing at work lately? And I mentioned this panel, and they went, oh, well, I mean, why is that an issue in the Asian community? Everybody's online, right? And, you know, and honestly, like, I cringed, right? But what that really reinforced to me, and I think as, you know, Congresswoman Matsui and Emily mentioned, right, is that there are stereotypes out there that people in the AAPI community lead communities of color in home broadband adoption and internet usage. But let's look at the facts. So right now, available data indicates that about 12% of AAPI households with children under the age of 18 don't have home internet. Low-income families in particular don't have access to high-speed internet service, and pockets of very high poverty exist amongst Southeast Asian American and Pacific Islanders. And in fact, something like 2 million members of the AAPI community live in poverty today. Between 1998 and 2019, Asian Americans were 4 percentage points less likely to go online compared with white non-Hispanics. And 1/3 of AAPI workers need digital skills, either because they have limited digital skills or none at all. And finally, 1 in 10 AAPI Americans don't have ready access to computers and broadband. And for all the reasons that, you know, Emily said, given, you know, how data is aggregated and sampled right now, you know, this likely underestimates the extent to which, you know, people in the AAPI community have, you know, barriers to accessing internet service and the necessary digital skills, such that, you know, both the, you know, the level of data aggregation together with these stereotypes and myths about the AAPI community can both in and of themselves be a barrier to getting people who would benefit from, you know, adoption or digital literacy programs, you know, from putting them in touch with these programs. But it's critically important that we, you know, that we find ways to address these challenges and get past, because for all the reasons that everyone has said, the pandemic has shone a light on how critical having internet service at home is when it comes to issues like remote learning or telecommuting, getting news and information, getting in touch with your doctor, right, when you can't leave the house, shopping for groceries safely, and ultimately, you know, what we're all working through right now, you know, trying to get a vaccine, right? We need to make sure that every American and every member of the AAPI community has access to the internet and digital skills needed to navigate it.
Thank you, Beth. Emily, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. Everyone's already done such a great job of bringing up a lot of important issues. I completely agree on the language issue, the data issue. I think it's really important to also think about history and culture and put things in context. So when you think about the AAPI community, you know, rightfully so, a lot of our community members do not trust government programs, do not want to engage in, you know, offers that are sent to them. There's a history of our data and our information being used against us and us being treated as perpetual foreigners. So I think it's really important to engage community partners who are already the trusted messengers to the communities we're trying to serve, to make sure that these efforts to increase access, to let them know about government programs like the EBB are going through the proper channels to actually get people to convert and think like, okay, this is a good program, I do need to engage. So that's really critical. I also want to bring up, you know, the affordability, access, all of that is important, but we also have to think about infrastructure, right? And the history there is important as well. You know, there's been historical redlining where areas like our Chinatowns where refugees live, folks that are lower income have kind of been seen as not worthy of investing in, you know. So we see things that persist today, like in San Francisco Chinatown, many folks are living in single residence occupancy homes, and you know, they're made out of concrete. There is no hard wiring. So even if we gave them money to spend it on buying an internet program, they actually don't have the wiring in the apartments to provide internet to them. So there are all these things that we need to think about. We can put money in people's pockets, but beyond that, how do we convert them to be regular, robust users of the internet? And so that brings me to the last point, which is digital literacy is really important, because giving connection isn't enough if people don't know how to actually use it, and also making sure that they're protected against things like privacy and security threats, so that this actually ends up being a net good instead of providing or potentially posing more harm to the communities.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to say one more thing, which is I think it's important to also think about Pacific Islands right now, and that community where part of the issue is, we have EBB programs right now ready to launch by the FCC. But if you look at the list of providers, the Pacific Islands actually don't have any providers available. And so that's an issue we need to think about as well, because they are a rural community. But when we talk about rural broadband issues, we often forget to bring them up.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everyone, for your answers to that question. So, we talked a lot about the challenges that we're facing today, and there are many, right? And this is further exacerbated by this COVID pandemic. So I want to ask you this. So what are some of the ways that your organizations are ensuring that there is internet affordability and adoption within the AAPI community? And Laura, I'll start off with you.
Sure. Thank you. Well, affordability and adoption, they're often used interchangeably. I think they are very distinct. Non-adoption can certainly be attributed to a lack of digital literacy skills, as Emily alluded to just a moment ago, but it can also be tied to affordability. So we really need to be looking at both issues, and that's what Charter is doing. And I can give you a few examples. Most recently, we've been working directly with schools and school districts across our footprint, our 41 state footprint, to support schools and actually offering high-speed home broadband internet to students, the teachers, staff, directly in their homes. And we're actually doing this through our Stay Connected K through 12 program. And it's an innovative solution to help get more households connected. And what it does is it really just gives schools and districts the flexibility to add students to the program when needed. So it's really good to be able to work with the schools and let them be on the front line, determining which students actually have the most needs, so that they can make sure that those students have that connectivity. We also continue to offer our Spectrum Internet Assist program, which is Charter's version of our low-cost broadband program, and it's available to eligible families and seniors. It's available across our 41 state footprint, and of course, we also plan to participate in the FCC's Emergency Broadband Benefit Program for low-income Americans, which, as many of you here know, is slated to begin this week on May 12th. And this program is one of, I think, many positive outcomes that came out of last year's COVID relief legislation, and it really provides a tremendous opportunity to help bridge the digital divide by allowing low-income families to stay connected, particularly during a difficult time. And I would just put a quick update here on just the digital literacy front. We, as a company, as a result of the pandemic, we actually doubled our commitment to digital education. And we've been working on a multi-year commitment to award $6 million in cash and in-kind donations that support broadband education and digital literacy efforts. It's incredibly important. We do this through an amazing program. It's called Spectrum Digital Education Grant Program. And we've been able to work with so many different local organizations to really advance digital inclusion within local communities. And I'm looking forward to sharing a little more about the program, because we've had some really interesting and creative partnerships through that program.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Sure.
Albert, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, for Verizon, we are making a commitment in terms of our 2025 business investment, combined exceed $3 billion. And this combines many different programs within Verizon. Like our Citizen Verizon, we want to help in terms of economic, environmental, social advancement initiatives, especially when it comes to, digital divide for the underserved communities. We are launching a new partnership with National 4-H Council, aimed at bringing digital skills and training to the rural communities through this type of program. Also, our Verizon Innovation Learning Program, the VILS program, is really about STEM in terms of helping students and instructors within the educational system. Once they get the connectivity, how can they actually use some of the innovative technologies that are within that as part of the connectivity, and also part of the EBB program too as well. So I mean, we're looking at this much more deliberately and strategically in terms of how we can reach the vast different types of underrepresented communities. And obviously, with our $10 million investment we announced, a couple of months ago as a result, Stop Asian Hate is directly to work with partners, the AAPI organizations that we lean on heavily to help guide us to as well in terms of reaching those communities. How can we help how can we help the communities get more beneficial in terms of that affordability and adoption? So that combined partnership all together, both fiscal and strategically through our business programs and through our community partnerships, is a critical part of this. So that's why, we definitely want to continue to engage at that level.
Thank you, Albert. Emily, I'll move on to you. How about the work that you're doing with AAJC?
Sure. So I think we're in a unique position where we're working directly with community partners who are on the ground, but we're also regularly working with folks on this call, the internet service providers, and kind of functioning as the bridge to make sure the lived experiences and needs of the community are being better understood by folks, at ISPs, but also, on the Hill, at the White House, with the FCC. So we're trying to make sure that we're amplifying the anecdotes from our communities, but also trying to facilitate better surveys and data collection information to make sure we better understand the specific needs and challenges. So with most recently with a lot of the advocacy around a permanent the EBB, and then hopefully we're going to see a permanent broadband subsidy, but we are not just making sure that there's more funding available for such programming, but making sure that with the implementation of the program, so with EBB, that there is outreach that is specifically targeting our communities who need it most. So making sure the FCC is providing information in translated languages for our community, making sure that they're collaborating directly with the trusted messengers in our communities. And we are, creating resources with, Michael, OCA, and CAPA to make sure that we have in-language instructions on how to sign up for programs like EBB through ISPs, like those on this call, like providing training to community partners to make sure they know how to sign people up, and conducting research, more outreach activities to make sure, it's great that we have these programs and we hope that they continue to be funded, but it's not really helpful if there's no adoption. So we're really pushing on that front as well.
Thank you very much, Emily. Before I go on to you, Nirali, I just want to remind our audience that you can ask questions in the Q&A section, and we'll make sure to have those questions answered at the end of the program. So Nirali, how about you?
Sure, Michael. At Comcast, connecting as many low-income families as possible to the internet has been a core value and commitment of our company for a decade. In that time, we've connected a total of more than 10 million people to home internet through our Internet Essentials program, which offers broadband to low-income families for $9.95 a month. We also offer free digital skills training and the option to purchase a discounted computer through that program. We've tried to double down on our commitment to digital equity during the pandemic, and over the last year, just as one example, we started standing up Wi-Fi connected lift zones in community centers across the country so that we can give students a safe space to go online and to engage in remote learning. We've stood up more than 600 of those lift zones across the country already, including in Seattle, San Francisco, Chicago, Philly, and we'll be continuing to roll that out this year. And through these efforts, one of the most important lessons that we've learned over the years is that there's no one size fits all approach to getting everyone connected. And so we need to reach each community where they are and meet their specific needs. And so, for example, with language barriers, what we've tried to do is make our Internet Essentials materials available to people in 30 different languages. Bengali, Burmese, I can't even go through the whole list here, Nepali, Punjabi, Urdu, Vietnamese, among others. We've tried to make our online application available in 7 languages. And we've also, through our call centers, created access to more than translators in more than 240 different languages, so that we can help break down language barriers and help those, including in the AAPI community, get assistance in getting online and getting connected and applying.
Thank you. And Beth, what are some of the ways that your organization or your company is doing to ensure that internet affordability and adoption within the API community?
Thank you, Michael. It's really cool to hear all the things that the different companies and Emily's organizations are doing. So first of all, hats off for you guys and thank you, but there's obviously a lot more work to be done, right? So first of all, AT&T does have a low cost offer targeting people who have low incomes. It's called Access from AT&T. And we make wireline broadband service available at $10 a month to eligible families with no annual contract, no deposit, no installation or equipment fees. It includes in-home Wi-Fi. And also, during the pandemic, we've expanded eligibility for access from AT&T, as well as waived all data overage fees because, we obviously recognize that it's not important now more than ever to make sure that everybody has the connectivity they need. Because limited English proficiency can be a barrier to adoption, and we know that 1 out of 3 roughly people in the AAPI community have limited English proficiency. We market access from AT&T in a number of languages, including Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. We also have application materials available in those languages as well as others. I'm very proud to say that AT&T is also going to be participating in the Emergency Broadband Benefit or EBB program that Emily and Laura and others mentioned. This is a program Congress established in the COVID-19 economic stimulus package enacted in December, and it's going to provide a discount of $50 per month on fixed or mobile broadband services during the pandemic, so long as funding is available for the program, which is, a much more robust benefit, right? Than like some of you are familiar with the Lifeline program, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It's a much more robust benefit that, I think it's fair to say, better recognizes just what 21st century communications cost today. So AT&T is participating. We will be making home broadband services available for the discount. Same thing with our mobile services, both postpaid and prepaid. And our subsidiary Cricket Wireless will be participating with a range of prepaid mobile services. The FCC just announced that eligible consumers can begin to enroll in the program beginning this Wednesday, May 12th. And again, we're super excited to be able to participate in the program to help people impacted by the pandemic. Together with, and we'll talk a little bit about, I think a little bit later today, the partnerships that AT&T has, but together with the discounted low-cost wireless solutions we're offering to more than 135,000 public and private schools, colleges, and universities to help keep students connected. Access from AT&T and the EBB benefit are part of AT&T's $2 billion 3-year commitment to help bridge the digital divide.
Thank you, everyone. It's really, really exciting to hear about all the different programs that are offered by your companies. And speaking of partnerships, Beth, I will be transitioning to this topic. So, and Beth, I'll start off with you. Can you talk about the partnerships that your company has in helping to drive more internet adoption within the API community?
Yes, thanks, Michael. AT&T partners with about 20 national AAPI organizations and about 50 AAPI organizations in total, and we support a number of programs that are focused on digital literacy and closing the digital divide. One of the really cool things we do, and this is actually with Michael's organization, OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, is we partner with groups like OCA to help spread the word about access from AT&T in our AAPI communities. And we also support the digital literacy efforts that OCA and other organizations get out there in the communities. In partnership with Connected Nation, we have also announced the selection of more than 100 organizations and schools across the country that will receive free wireless hotspots and wireless data and content filtering services. Through this program, we'll reach more than 35,000 students with this connectivity, including some of our nation's most vulnerable students, such as English language learners. Most of these students have lacked access to the connectivity and devices needed to learn since the shift to remote learning last year. And so one of these organizations, for example, is the Hmong American Peace Academy, or HAPA, in Milwaukee, which was founded to preserve the Hmong culture while helping students to become active and knowledgeable citizens while thriving in academics. Nearly all of HAPA students are Asian Pacific Islanders and have low incomes, and HAPA will be receiving 500 wireless hotspots to allow students without reliable internet access to learn remotely. We also financially support organizations that support underserved, underrepresented low-income communities, in particular focusing on organizations that support at-risk students, including the Southeast Asian Resource Center, the Asian and Pacific Islander American Scholarship Fund, and the Hmong American Partnership. So we're tremendously excited about these partnerships, and we're very grateful to all of our partners.
Thank you very much, Beth. Laura, I'll move on to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I actually would like to take this opportunity to go back to our Spectrum Digital Education Program and talk a little bit about how this program is contributing to some of the improved broadband adoption that hopefully we continue to see in the months and years ahead. So through the program, we actually have grants that are awarded to local community organizations, and it really supports their efforts to educate communities on the benefits of getting online. I'm a big proponent of when you go local and you allow those organizations to really figure out what are the programs that work best to meet the needs of those communities that they represent, those programs are much more successful and much more effective. And in our case, for Spectrum Digital Education, for the grant program, the grants and the funding that's been provided has really been used in a variety of ways. It's been used to provide computers and laptops to organizations and to individuals. There's been digital literacy and education classes that have come out of these partnerships. There's even been new technology labs that have been created to teach essential digital skills that, as we all know, are so incredibly critical right now for upward mobility. And one example actually that with a local organization that we did last year was with, it's an organization called the San Gabriel Valley Japanese Community Center. It is a very long acronym. It reminds me of like the Diversity Advisory Committee's acronym, which is also like a mouthful. But they've received a grant, and interestingly enough, they've been using it for digital literacy and training with older seniors and adults. So it's kind of goes back to some of the comments that we heard earlier from some of the panelists about, how age and how geography kind of impacts how these programs are developed to make sure that they're meeting the needs of those specific individuals within the communities. So this group is actually based out of LA, and it's just one example of so many that illustrate how public-private partnerships can really drive digital inclusion in local communities. And as I said earlier, I think when programs are rolled out through trusted community partners, and I think Emily alluded to this earlier as well, they have a greater impact and they're much more sustainable. So I'm really glad to see Charter continuing to invest in this program. And I'm also really pleased to see similar programs being rolled out across other industries. And I hope to see the trend continue, because I think that there is a real value that comes out of these types of partnerships.
Thank you very much, Laura. Albert, I'll move on to you. So what are some of the partnerships that Verizon is doing to help drive more internet adoption within the API community?
Yeah, like with many of the conversations or organizations that were talked amongst the other industry groups, it's very similar. I mean, we did come out with our $10 million investment in supporting many groups such as NCAP, AAJC, and National ACE. But with National ACE, for example, National Asian Chamber Entrepreneurship, one aspect we do need to talk about is the country's AAPI small business community. A lot of us are multi-generational, micro businesses all around the country in urban, suburban, and rural environments. And those businesses, for them to survive, need also affordable and connectivity. So all that put together, but also internally too, for us is our own AAPI ERGs internally, that we, within the several thousand Asian American diverse employees that we have, also take it upon ourselves to educate the many different sectors, which each of our individual communities on what we're doing to help educate, our local families, our communities, and where we are around the country too as well. So all that put together, the continued evolution of these partnerships, and especially with the small business community, I think is going to go a long way in terms of that, but we want to continue to strengthen that as we continue to go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. Nirali.
Sure, Michael, one of the reasons that Comcast has been able to connect more than 10 million people to the internet, more than 10 million low-income people to the internet over the last 10 years is because of our partners. As Emily and Laura were mentioning, partners in the community can not only raise awareness about programs that may be available to their stakeholders, but also serve as trusted voices within the community, and that is so important. And so just as one or two examples of some of the partnerships we've had, one is with Self-Help for the Elderly in San Francisco, which serves many AAPI seniors, helps them to get online safely, learn how to use devices, and really how to take advantage of this technology for lifelong learning and just to stay connected with family and friends. Another organization that we've partnered with is CMAC, which is Southeast Asian Mutual Assistance Association Coalition. And among other things, we've worked with them to create, they serve new immigrants and refugees. And so one of the things we've done is work with them to create a computer lab for digital literacy classes, as well as ESL classes, for their constituents. So those are just some of the examples of the partnerships we've been working on to drive internet adoption, but also just wanted to mention that in addition, Comcast has, just like many of the other organizations on this panel, worked with Asian-led and Asian-focused social justice organizations and nonprofits on diversity and inclusion efforts. And just last week, Comcast announced $2 million in grants to several organizations that are working to address increasing violence against the AAPI community. So I know that is slightly off topic here, when focusing on internet adoption, but also just wanted to mention that as well.
Thank you, Nirali. Before I transition to the next topic, I want to remind our audience again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and we will get to those questions in about 10 minutes. So I want to now move on to another topic, and many API communities live in rural and other historically underserved areas where there is a lack of internet access and adoption. So what are some ways that policymakers are addressing these issues, and what should policymakers do to close these gaps? And Laura, I'll start with you.
I get to change the conversation. Thank you. So much of our discussion today, as we all see, has been focused on affordability and adoption, which is great. And there are still new proposals for Congress to certainly consider, including a long-term broadband benefit program, which was raised earlier as well, and that will work to ensure that low-income families remain connected even once this pandemic hopefully is behind us sooner than later. But I think it's also important to not lose sight of the fact that there are many Americans still living in digital deserts, right? They do not have any connectivity. Last year's FCC broadband report stated that there's still 4.5 million Americans that have no access to high-speed broadband. And 78% of those individuals, 11 million in total, live in rural areas. So back in February, Charter, we actually announced a multi-year $5 billion broadband build-out initiative. And through this initiative, we'll deliver gigabit high-speed broadband access to more than 1 million unserved customer locations. And this includes many rural areas. And this is a private investment that's also been offset by $1.2 billion that we won in support from the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which some of you may be familiar, we call it RDOF. And this is actually an effort that was introduced by the Federal Communications Commission last year as a way to bring digital opportunity to more unserved areas. And this is something we're really excited about. It's a public-private partnership. It's an opportunity to expand broadband access to more unserved communities, and we're reaching folks across 24 states. We also recognize as we move towards that construction phase, there are important things to keep in mind, right? We realize the importance of working collaboratively on the ground with localities to make sure we're minimizing barriers to deployment. And I'd say in this regard, our industry continues to work with the commission to make sure we're clarifying rules that will help speed deployment and reduce costs so we can make sure that we're reaching more people in the fastest way possible. And I'll just give a quick example of this. In terms of having more efficient processes in place for our industry, it would be helpful to be able to attach to utility poles a little more easily. And I know people will be like, why are you focused on attaching to utility poles? But this is actually the way that most of the country's broadband infrastructure is deployed. So it's important. It's not a sexy issue. It's not one that people necessarily want to talk about all day. But I think as Congress determines the best way to allocate federal funding to close the digital divide, addressing barriers to deployment and targeting funding to those communities that are really truly unserved will help get us closer to finally ensuring 100% connectivity. It's a lot of areas that we need to address, but I think that is certainly an area that Congress is focused on, and I certainly would encourage members to continue to prioritize that. And this is also an opportunity for stakeholders and community organizations to also be able to lift their voices up in support of this.
Thank you, Laura. Nirali, do you have thoughts on this?
Sure. In addition to the points that, the very good points that Laura raised about the infrastructure and deployment gap, I did want to go back and also elaborate just for a minute on the adoption gap and the Emergency Broadband Benefit, or EBB, program that Emily and others were mentioning. Comcast is excited to participate in that program as well. And it was a great, important first step by policymakers to help address the adoption gap. As others mentioned, it's a subsidy of up to $50 per month. It is funded through congressional appropriations, and it is available to eligible low-income households, including those families with students who are in the National School Lunch Program. And so it's a very important first step to helping to address this issue, but it is just temporary. And so, it really is important that we have a permanent, sustainable, long-term, low-income broadband subsidy program. I think as AAJC, Emily's organization, has pointed out previously, in 2016, 3/4 of Asian Americans and 1/3 of Pacific Islanders were enrolled in Medicaid or some other public insurance program. And so, the need for low-income subsidies for broadband as well, including in the AAPI community, is there and is very important.
Thank you, Nirali. Beth, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you, Michael. What the question is highlighting, and I think what both Laura and Nirali highlighted, is, when you think about the digital divide, the pandemic's really exposed two digital divides, right, that persist in America. The first being the availability divide, which Laura talked about, and the second being the affordability divide, which Nirali talked about. The availability divide being, where networks don't physically reach today, and then the affordability divide is, how do you get internet service to people, who may not be able to afford it? And these are really two different issues with two different solutions. So I'm going to touch really quickly on both of them. Totally agree with Nirali. And, so far as the affordability divide is concerned, the EBB program that's, will start enrolling customers this week can be sort of a bridge, right, in the near term. But from AT&T's perspective, we believe that there needs to be some sort of a permanent broadband benefit that builds on the EBB program, but also looks at the existing Lifeline program, which as some of you may know is a program managed by the FCC. It supports discounts on broadband service today. But the Lifeline program is falling short, and so we should really look to the program to figure out what are the shortcomings that are keeping the Lifeline program from being an effective tool to help address affordability issues. Today, the Lifeline program only about 26% of eligible households participate. That's roughly a little bit more than 8 million households. Compare this to the SNAP program, where more than 18 million households participate. And the reason why I highlight SNAP is that every household that participates in SNAP is automatically eligible for Lifeline. And yet, only about, like a 40% of SNAP households are actually participating in Lifeline. So we ask ourselves, why is that? There are probably a number of reasons, including the fact that mainstream broadband providers today don't participate because, frankly, there are disincentives created by all of the body of regulations attendant to the Lifeline program that really discourage providers from participating. And as a result, consumers really don't have many service choices from the providers who do participate. And so for all those reasons, AT&T recommends that the Lifeline program be transformed from a discount that providers are required to reflect on bills, which we can have many conversations about how we believe that's a disincentive for providers to participate, but ultimately it also then results in limiting the options available to consumers. So we believe instead any permanent broadband benefit ought to be delivered directly to participating consumers in the form of, something similar to a reloadable debit card account that the Lifeline administrator would deposit, benefits in each month, which consumers can then use to help pay for the broadband services of their choice from the provider of their choice. This is really similar to how the government delivers benefits for the SNAP program, which consumers can use to purchase the foods of their choice from any one of like 147,000 participating food retailers. It's also similar to the way the Social Security program delivers benefits, where Social Security recipients can choose to get their benefits direct deposited into direct express debit MasterCards each month, which beneficiaries can then use to buy things or pay for whatever they need to. We believe this change would ultimately encourage more providers to participate. It would make more offers available to participating consumers, and really then put consumers in the driver's seat so far as the services that they are able to choose from. As to the availability divide, again, agree very much with the things that Laura and Nirali highlighted. From AT&T's perspective, we think there are like sort of three critical things that policymakers ought to be thinking about. There are a number of proposals in Congress right now that would direct very significant amounts of funding to address the availability divide once and for all, which is, obviously really great news. The Biden administration has proposed to direct $100 billion to address the availability divide. And so again, three things that, AT&T recommends policymakers focus on. The first being, we really need accurate mapping to be to target government funding, to the specific homes and small businesses that don't have servicing, like Emily. And as Emily highlighted, these are predominantly, but certainly not entirely in rural areas, right? Like there are certainly areas within, urban areas or ex-urban areas that don't yet have robust broadband service. And so the good news is that the FCC is well on its way to getting us more accurate address level maps that, we think will be really a key tool to target available government funding to address availability needs. Second, we also think it's critically important that government funding not be used to overbuild areas that already have very robust service that's sufficient not only for American families, just today, but also for the foreseeable future. Private investment has been the engine that has driven the broadband services that are so widely available today. Like the industry's invested more than $1.6 billion since 1996 to get broadband deployed so quickly throughout the U.S. And again, there's more work to be done, but it's critically important that government work with the private sector and not not interfere where the market's working or can work. And finally, and from that perspective, by the way, we think then it's really more important to get service to people who don't have robust service or, who don't have any service at all. And finally, again, because, you want to incentivize the private sector to do their thing, we think competitive processes should be used to award support, and all available technologies should be able to compete because, the pace of technological developments are happening so quickly that, really we think all technologies ought to be on the table to address this very important issue.
Thank you, Beth, and also thank you, Laura and Nirali, for providing that policy perspective. Now, we've talked a lot about a lot today, but I'm curious to ask everyone here, before we move on to Q&A, what would you say is a key takeaway from today's discussion? And Laura, I'll start off with you.
Yeah, yay. We have covered so much in this discussion. I don't want to be too broad, but I do think that we need to realize it's an all of the above approach. When we're tackling the digital divide, we need to give equal attention to all the factors contributing to non-adoption. And that includes all the things we've discussed here: affordability, access, digital literacy training and education. And I do think we are well on our way, but we really need to continue to work with policymakers. And we need to ensure that our most vulnerable and disadvantaged communities are being prioritized. And I will say that making sure that there are proper guardrails in place to ensure that those who remain unserved don't continue to get left behind even more is going to be critically important. This includes being very targeted and careful about how federal funding is being used to support both the access and adoption needs of unserved and underserved communities. So that will be something I'm sure we're going to continue discussing for the months to come.
Thank you, Laura. Albert, how about you?
Yeah, recently, I host what we call a public sector webinar series, and one of our focus areas was education. And I had the chance to invite an old friend, Mark Matsui, from the president of Portland Community College. And he said that still the greatest need out there is the fact that we need equalized connectivity. And I think that's probably we've talked about all of our industry groups and the advocacy groups. But at the end of the day, the connectivity is, the most basic and most important thing that is needed to reach all the AAPI community leaders or organizations and communities around the country. So I think all of that put together, we're making progress. I think now that we have governmental funding, we have amazing community-based partner organizations like everyone here. Then there's also the policy side. So all that put together, I think we're definitely moving that needle in terms of all the ingredients of that recipe is there. But we have to keep pushing, especially work closely together with our community-based organizations in terms of when we talk to the policymakers and policyholders. So that's something I know we'll carry that forward. But moving ahead, it does look positive. But again, it is a continue evolution and conversation in terms of also the technology innovation that is happening too as well. That's happening at light speed. So we have to make sure that the communities are also get access to that innovation technology at just the same speed. But anyway, looking forward to continuing this conversation, and thank you.
Thank you, Albert. Emily, how about you? What is the key takeaway from today's discussion?
Sure. I want to highlight the importance of centering our communities and making sure that we're listening to what folks are saying that they need on the ground, that we understand the specific needs and the challenges, and that when we design our solutions or make proposals through legislation and programming, that we actually test and ask for feedback to make sure we're actually reaching the people who need it the most, and making sure that people can really benefit from these internet connections to uplift and empower communities with things like health, education, that are ultimately going to improve their lives and our communities overall. And a reminder that this is, an equity issue. I think when we talk tech politics, people get a little bit like, oh, it's too technical, like I shut off my brain. But it really is an equity issue, because the reason people don't have connections today is based on historical discrimination and disparities. And these structural inequalities are going to be exacerbated if we don't intervene to correct them now. So it is a really critical piece of not just, education, health outcomes and things like that, but establishing racial justice for our communities.
Thank you, Emily. Nirali, I'll move on to you.
I think one of the things we've heard today from just about everyone, and I think that just wanted to echo, is that I think we all stand ready to work with policymakers on coming up with a permanent broadband subsidy that can help address some of the adoption and digital equity issues that have been discussed today for long after the pandemic is over.
Thank you, Nirali. Beth?
I'd like to say that, the companies and organizations represented today are all doing amazing work. And Laura, Albert, Emily, Nirali, was really great to hear about all the things that you all are doing to address adoption and digital literacy needs, as well as other access needs among the AAPI community. That's tremendously encouraging. There's clearly, though, as I think we've all highlighted, more work that we all need to do and that others can help us to do. But working together, I think we're up to the task. So thank you.
Thank you, Beth. So now we're going to move on to our audience Q&A. And so allow me to ask our first question from our audience. And our first question is, what are your companies doing to ensure that our first responders, emergency workers, and healthcare workers receive access to broadband? And I will open this up to anyone that wants to speak first. Oh, Albert, did I see you volunteer?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. What are your companies doing to ensure that our first responders, emergency workers, and healthcare workers receive access to broadband?
Is no one going first? All All right. Well, okay. No one say anything. I'll go ahead and do it. I was gonna throw that one at Beth because since they have first net, but but anyway, no. I mean, it's part of the overall. I think a lot of the multiple conversations again with at the local level, especially with local community organizations, hearing what their challenges are. You know, working with our state and local government affairs folks locally, because it is a very disparate system in a lot of ways, and as far as reaching the communities. Because when you pick up the phone and dial 911. That routing goes many different directions. So it is a complex problem, but overall we are very cognizant of what is happening there, and it's just going to take a lot of local and community-based efforts and organizing and conversations overall. So I do know that's happening at the local level quite a bit, but also at the national level too as well. But.
And sorry, Michael. Sorry, Albert. I thought you were going to go first.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's what I was holding about. But as Albert mentioned, AT&T in partnership with the government is building out a nationwide first responder network called FirstNet, and it was following 9/11 that. Really, the need for sort of a unified nationwide communications network, was highlighted, and so we've been working with first responders and the federal government nationwide to build out the network, and we're making tremendous progress. So thank you for asking that question.
Okay, unless anyone else wants to respond, I'll move on to our next question, which is. How can we help members of our community with disabilities to ensure they have access?
So I think, if I may chime in, Michael,
go ahead,
and allow others to chime in as well. I think, one of the themes that we were discussing earlier about making sure that you are reaching each community and trying to meet their specific needs is very important, not just with different groups as far as race or ethnicity, but also, as you're mentioning, with disabilities, making sure, for example, that our call centers have ASL interpreters. That's something that we do to make sure that somebody who wants to access Internet Essentials is able to apply and get online without having to overcome, further hurdles. So that's just one small example of how we need to make sure that we're reaching out to everyone in multiple different ways to ensure that everyone gets connected.
Yeah, and I would just add, from Charter's perspective, obviously we work very closely with the accessibility community. We have partnerships in place with many different organizations. And what we hear a lot is when you're dealing with people living with disabilities, you do have different challenges, and sometimes those individuals are dealing with higher levels of unemployment. So when we're looking at programs such as the permanent broadband program that we're hoping Congress will move forward with, that's an opportunity for us to also engage with the disability community and make sure that their interests and their concerns are being raised at the front end as we're having preliminary conversations on the Hill, and as we're thinking through what a program can look like so that we are inclusive and we're thinking about all communities as we move forward in the policymaking process. And I think that's when the partnerships that you have with the accessibility community become so critical, because if you do not have that line of communication with that community, you're kind of missing the opportunity to really make sure that the solutions we're bringing to the table are comprehensive and they're as robust as possible, and that they're including the needs of all communities.
And I'll just add, I'm obviously not an accessibility expert, but I do think that this is a really important intersectional issue. And one of the things that we see across a lot of these underrepresented, underserved communities is the need for better user testing, design, and feedback. And so it's not enough to just think about the needs. We really have to go through the process and see if it actually works after we take their feedback, or after we take their initial concerns, having an open feedback loop. And so with, programs like the upcoming EBB that we've mentioned several times, we want to make sure, okay, we put in a lot of preparation to make sure it's functional. functional and as easy as possible. But once people start registering and they come across challenges and barriers, how are we going to make sure that this is an agile process where we're incorporating feedback and constantly improving it to make sure that it actually does address their needs?
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. So we are near the end of our panel, but I want to ask each of our distinguished panelists just to share brief closing remarks. And Emily, I'll take it back to you.
Oh, well, I'm just so thankful to have this opportunity. Like I've alluded to before, it really does take all of us. So the advocacy community, the actual community on the ground, our internet service provider partners, and folks who are on the Hill, making the legislation. It's really going to take all of us to make sure we're addressing this. And yeah, I just reiterate the importance of seeing this through, racial justice lens. It's not accidental when we look at who does not have connections today. And, this is across the board, not just for AAPI communities, but, folks who have disabilities, folks who are, other people of color, immigrants, non-English speakers, the elderly. And so I think we have to be really intentional when we think about policy solutions, to look at the history and what are the historical structures that have created what we have today, and think about it holistically in that way.
Thank you, Emily. Nirali, any closing remarks?
I'll just say, echo again, thank you for Apex thank you to Apex for having us. And I think it's just important to remember, as others have said today, that the pandemic has really highlighted not only the deployment, adoption, and also digital literacy gaps that we all knew needed to continue to be worked on, but the pandemic really shone a light on these three different gaps. And while America's broadband networks were there to help so many people learn and work from home remotely over the last year or so, we do, as Beth and others were alluding to, have so much more work to do. And so we look forward to continuing to work with our partner organizations like Emily's organization, work with policymakers, and work with the community to try and ensure that we can get everyone connected.
Thank you, Nirali. Laura?
Well, it's been a pleasure. This conversation has been great. It's been nice hearing what all of the companies and organizations are doing around adoption, affordability, digital literacy issues. I will say, I think it's important to not forget the power of community partnerships and public-private partnerships. In fact, last week during the ENC committee hearing on broadband equity, Congresswoman Matsui, who opened this up today, she actually mentioned the important role that anchor institutions such as libraries play in advancing digital inclusion. And I am maybe a little biased to the issue because I serve on the FCC's Diversity Advisory Committee, and we're exploring this very issue. And as part of the digital inclusion subgroup, which I co-lead, we're working on a report on this issue. And someone mentioned Connected Nation. Connected Nation is the vice chair of this Diversity Advisory Committee. Anna Gomez with Wiley Ryan is also the chair. So I think that area is so ripe for further exploration. And as things open up, there is a really great opportunity to look at anchor institutions such as libraries, because they are that trusted community partner. They can really help advance digital inclusion within communities. And so while we're thinking about, our industry efforts, and then you have Congress moving with their areas, and you have community organizations that are doing work, and then we also have these anchor institutions, which a lot of organizations, including like Girls Who Code, they're doing amazing partnership work with these libraries and developing some really incredible programs that are driving digital inclusion and broadband adoption. So I would just say, let's be creative in terms of how we're developing programs and how we're creating initiatives to tackle this issue.
Thank you very much, Laura. Beth, move on to you.
Thanks, Michael. I think that hearing the conversation again, it's really, really important to recognize that if we're to get broadband to every American, again, there are three legs of this proverbial stool, right, that we need to address. There's the availability issue, there's the affordability issue, and then there's issues like digital literacy. And if we're going to get broadband and internet service to everyone, then we really need to address all three of them together. One of the things we talked about is some of the programs we've highlighted today, or some of the proposals we've highlighted today are, at the federal level. But because issues like affordability or digital literacy and adoption, as others have said, they're really not one size fits all solutions for those issues. And you really need to know your specific community and group, right? Like to like, if we're going to figure out like, why is, such and such a group of people, why are they not subscribing to broadband? Then, you need to know specifically, why is broadband, why do they feel like broadband isn't necessary for their lives or isn't relevant to them, right? And so that is really an issue that, again, local organizations on the ground play a tremendously important role, and so do state and local governments, right? And and so the important thing, I think, from my perspective is, obviously this is a really big table, and everybody needs to have a seat at the table and have a role. And again, there's a tremendously important role for everyone. So thank you,
Beth. Thank you. And last but not least, Albert.
Oh, thank you. Well, one, it's great to see everyone here. Great to see Chris. Been a long time. Great reunion. No, I really am inspired. I think the fact that the thought leadership, the initiatives, both for ourselves and all the other companies and community-based organizations are working on. This last year has just been absolutely, in terms of what has happened from George Floyd. And actually, if you think what happened to George Floyd, connectivity, we would not have seen what had happened out of that tragedy. And I think the steps that both on government and each of our corporations, especially Verizon, we've done to take steps toward greater and social equity and economic equity, and now we're talking about digital equity, has all come a long way. So I think the power in this room has really been inspiring. I want to continue to work with the organizations here and make progress. And I think we are doing that as both community, government, and organizations. That's what it takes at the end of the day, and each of us individually within our companies. So that's what has really inspired me. So I'm looking forward to next time we get together and see what progress we've made at that point.
Thank you. So this concludes our panel on the digital divide and lack of access. Again, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our audience for being part of this important conversation. We're now going to take 30 minutes for a break before our next panel. Thank you again for watching.
Thank you, everyone.